Hello and welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into a topic that's as shadowy as it is significant, the concept of political puppets. Now, what does that even mean? It's a term often thrown around with a healthy dose of accusation to describe world leaders who appear to be acting less on behalf of their own people and more on behalf of powerful Western nations. Think of it like a global ventriloquist act, only instead of a dummy on a knee, it's a head of state in a presidential palace, and instead of telling jokes, they're signing trade deals that might just happen to benefit, say, Washington or Paris. It's the uncomfortable suggestion that sovereign decisions are being subtly, or not so subtly, guided by an external hand. Now, before we get into the thick of it, a few crucial disclaimers. The list we've compiled tonight is not some definitive, legally binding indictment, far from it. This is a collection based on a cocktail of public perception, extensive media reporting, and the often conflicting analyses of political experts. These are leaders who, for various reasons, have found themselves at the center of a storm of allegations regarding their political autonomy. The narrative surrounding them is frequently one of Western backing, financial support, or strategic alignment that raises serious questions about whose interests are truly being served. And finally, this list is by no means exhaustive. You could probably make a list of 100 such figures without breaking a sweat. Our goal here isn't to have the final word, but to start a conversation. We want to peel back the layers of international diplomacy and expose the complex, often murky relationships that exist between nations. So, grab your tinfoil hats, or don't. This is all surprisingly well documented. And let's begin our countdown of 10 leaders who have been accused of being the West's men and women on the inside. Kicking off our list at number 10, we have a man who became an international political celebrity almost overnight, Juan Guaido of Venezuela. For a brief, surreal period, he was, depending on who you asked, either the legitimate interim president of Venezuela or a complete nobody. It's a fascinating case of political theater where the stage was the world and the directors were, allegedly, sitting in the White House. Guaido, as the head of the National Assembly, declared himself acting president in January 2019. Directly challenging the rule of Nicolas Maduro. This wasn't just some rogue declaration shouted into the void. Almost immediately, a chorus of Western nations, led by the United States under the Trump administration, rushed to recognize him. It was a coordinated, almost instantaneous endorsement. Countries like Canada, Germany, France, and the UK all fell in line, treating him as the legitimate head of state. This wasn't just diplomatic pleasantry. It came with tangible power, including control over Venezuela's overseas assets. Critics immediately and loudly pointed out that this looked less like a grassroots democratic movement and more like a prepackaged, US-approved regime change operation. The narrative spun was that Guaido was the people's choice against Maduro's tyranny. However, the speed and uniformity of the Western response raised eyebrows. It felt less like a reaction to events on the ground, and more like the activation of a long-prepared plan. The accusations were that Guaido was not a product of a popular uprising, but a carefully chosen instrument for American foreign policy, designed to oust a government that had long been a thorn in Washington's side. His political platform seemed almost secondary to his willingness to align with U.S. interests. The evidence cited by detractors was compelling. There were reports of meetings between Venezuelan opposition figures and U.S. officials long before his public declaration. The strategy of economic sanctions combined with political recognition of an alternative leader was a classic playbook move. For many observers, both inside and outside Venezuela, Guaido became the face of modern interventionism, a charismatic, presentable figurehead whose legitimacy was manufactured in foreign capitals, not earned on the streets of Caracas. Ultimately, the gambit failed. Guaido never managed to secure the loyalty of the Venezuelan military, a critical component for any real power grab. His support on the ground, while present, never swelled into the unstoppable wave his backers had hoped for. He slowly faded from the international spotlight, a stark reminder that simply being recognized by the West doesn't automatically translate into actual power. He remains a potent symbol of how external powers can attempt to anoint a leader, creating a puppet who, in the end, couldn't quite get the strings to work. Coming in at number 9 is a figure whose presidency ended in one of the most chaotic and televised collapses of a government in recent memory, Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan. An academic with a background at the World Bank and Johns Hopkins University, Ghani was, on paper, the perfect candidate to lead a modernizing, Western-aligned Afghanistan. His fluency in the language of international development and his deep connections in Washington made him a comfortable and familiar partner for the United States and its allies. Ghani's presidency, which began in 2014, was inextricably linked to American support. He was in power during the peak of the U.S. military and financial presence in the country. His government was almost entirely dependent on foreign aid, with a significant portion of its budget funded directly by the United States. This financial lifeline gave Washington immense leverage. Every policy decision, from military strategy against the Taliban to economic reforms, was made under the long shadow of American influence. Critics argued that Ghani was less a sovereign leader and more of a chief administrator for a project conceived and funded by the West. The perception of him as a puppet was widespread among many Afghans. He was often seen as isolated in his presidential palace, surrounded by Western-educated advisors and disconnected from the realities of his own country. His reliance on U.S. military might to prop up his government created a deep legitimacy crisis. To many, he was the face of an occupation, a leader whose authority came not from the consent of the governed, but from the firepower of a foreign superpower. This perception was a powerful recruiting tool for the Taliban, who framed their insurgency as a patriotic war against a foreign occupier and its local proxy. The nature of this relationship was laid bare during the disastrous U.S. withdrawal in August 2021. As the American military departed, Ghani's government crumbled with breathtaking speed. It was a house of cards whose foundation was being pulled out from underneath it. The Afghan National Army, trained and equipped at immense cost by the U.S., offered little resistance, highlighting that their loyalty was perhaps more to the American paycheck than to the Ghani administration. Ghani himself, fleeing the country by helicopter as the Taliban entered Kabul, became the defining image of his presidency. His final act cemented his legacy in the eyes of many as a leader who was utterly dependent on his Western patrons. When the patrons left, the leader had no choice but to leave as well. It was a tragic and humiliating end, not just for a presidency, but for a 20-year nation-building experiment. Ashraf Ghani's story serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when a leader's power is so closely tied to external support that it cannot survive on its own, making him a textbook example for our list. Our number 8 spot takes us to Ukraine and its 5th president, the billionaire confectioner Petro Poroshenko. Known as the Chocolate King, Poroshenko came to power in 2014 in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution, which ousted the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. This was a pivotal moment for Ukraine, a country caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war between Russia and the West. Poroshenko firmly and very publicly chose the West. From the moment he took office, Poroshenko's administration was characterized by its staunchly pro-Western stance. He actively pursued closer ties with the European Union and NATO, making membership in these organizations a cornerstone of his foreign policy. This alignment was met with enthusiastic support from Washington and Brussels. The US and EU provided Ukraine with significant financial aid packages, military assistance, albeit non-lethal for a time, and crucial diplomatic backing in its conflict with Russia, following the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. This heavy reliance on Western support led to accusations, particularly from Moscow and its allies, that Poroshenko was little more than a pawn in the West's strategy to contain Russia. The narrative was that the Maidan Revolution itself was a Western-orchestrated coup, and Poroshenko was the hand-picked successor installed to ensure Ukraine remained firmly in the Western sphere of influence. His government's decisions, from economic policy dictated by IMF loan conditions to military strategy, were seen as being heavily influenced, if not outright directed, by his Western partners. The optics often reinforced this perception. Poroshenko was frequently seen meeting with high-profile Western leaders like Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, and Barack Obama. Figures like then-Vice President Joe Biden became deeply involved in Ukrainian affairs, publicly pushing for anti-corruption reforms and even, famously, the firing of a prosecutor. While framed as helpful guidance to critics, this was clear evidence of a sovereign nation's internal affairs being micromanaged by a foreign power, with Poroshenko as the compliant local manager. While many Ukrainians saw alignment with the West as a necessary survival strategy against Russian aggression, the puppet label stuck. It painted him as a leader who had traded one master, Moscow, for another, Washington. His presidency highlights the incredibly difficult position of leaders in countries on the fault lines of great power competition. Aligning with one side for protection and support almost inevitably opens you up to accusations of being controlled by them. And for Petro Poroshenko, that accusation became a central and defining feature of his time in power. At number 7, we look back to a predecessor of Ashraf Ghani, the very first leader of post-Taliban Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. With his trademark Karakul hat and elegant cloaks, Karzai became the international face of a new Afghanistan after the US-led invasion in 2001. He was plucked from relative obscurity and installed as the head of the Afghan Interim administration, a decision made not in Kabul, but at a UN-sponsored conference in Bonn, Germany, with heavy American influence. From the very beginning, Karzai's rule was entirely contingent on American and NATO backing. His personal security was often handled by U.S. private contractors, and his government was propped up by billions of dollars in international aid and the presence of over 100,000 foreign troops. For the first several years of his presidency, his authority barely extended beyond the capital, Kabul. This led to the derisive nickname the Mayor of Kabul, highlighting his near-total dependence on his foreign protectors. The perception of Karzai as a puppet was immediate and pervasive. The Taliban and other insurgent groups successfully used this narrative to portray him as an illegitimate leader imposed by foreign invaders. They argued that he did not represent the Afghan people, but rather the interests of the occupying forces. This narrative resonated in many rural and conservative parts of the country, where suspicion of outsiders is deeply ingrained, making it incredibly difficult for Karzai to build a broad national consensus. Interestingly, Karzai's own relationship with his Western, particularly American backers, grew increasingly fraught over time. As his presidency wore on, he became more openly critical of U.S. military tactics, particularly civilian casualties from airstrikes. He would often lash out in public, accusing the U.S. of acting like a colonial power and undermining Afghan sovereignty. This created a bizarre dynamic. A leader who was simultaneously seen as a puppet by his own people and who was also publicly biting the hand that fed him. These outbursts were interpreted in two ways. To his supporters, it was a sign that he was finally growing into his role and asserting Afghan independence. To his critics and many in the West, it was the petulance of a leader who was deeply insecure about his own legitimacy, trying to build nationalist credentials by criticizing his benefactors. Either way, his entire presidency was defined by this fundamental contradiction. A leader installed by the West, who could never escape the perception that he was their man, no matter how much he protested. For our number 6 pick, we travel to the Caucasus region and the nation of Georgia to look at its former president, Mikhail Saakashvili. A charismatic U.S.-educated lawyer, Saakashvili swept to power in 2003 on the back of the Rose Revolution, a peaceful protest movement that ousted the old Soviet-era leadership. He presented himself as a modern, pro-Western reformer determined to pull Georgia out of Russia's orbit and integrate it fully with the West. Saakashvili's reform agenda was radical and explicitly modeled on Western liberal democracies. He launched a massive anti-corruption crackdown, reformed the police force with U.S. assistance, and aggressively pursued membership in both NATO and the European Union. This agenda made him a darling in Western capitals, particularly in Washington under the George W. Bush administration, which saw him as a key Democratic ally in a strategically vital, energy-rich region. The U.S. and EU poured in financial aid and provided extensive political and military support. This enthusiastic Western backing was the primary fuel for accusations that Saakashvili was a Western project, a puppet installed to challenge Russian influence in its near abroad. Moscow viewed his every move with deep suspicion, seeing him as an agent of American expansionism right on its border. His relentless push for NATO membership was seen as a direct threat to Russian security interests, creating a highly volatile situation. The rhetoric from both sides became increasingly heated, with Saakashvili positioning himself as a bastion of freedom against Russian imperialism. The culmination of these tensions was the disastrous Russo-Georgian War in 2008. After a series of provocations, Georgian forces moved into the breakaway region of South Ossetia, prompting a massive and overwhelming Russian military response. Saakashvili had seemingly calculated that his strong ties with the West would guarantee direct military intervention on his behalf. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. While the West offered verbal condemnation and humanitarian aid, no country was willing to go to war with Russia over Georgia. In the aftermath of the war, the puppet narrative solidified. Critics argued that Saakashvili, emboldened by his American patrons, had recklessly provoked the Russian bear, believing his strings led to a safety net that wasn't there. He was seen as a leader who had gambled his country's security on the promises of Western support and lost badly. His story is a classic example of a pro-Western leader whose close alignment with foreign powers led not to security, but to conflict, leaving him and his country exposed when the chips were down. At the halfway point, number 5, we have a slightly different case. Not a president who came to power with Western help, but a monarch whose kingdom's survival has long depended on a strategic alliance with the West. We're talking about King Abdullah II of Jordan. Jordan is a fascinating country. It has few natural resources, is surrounded by conflict, and has absorbed massive waves of refugees, yet it remains remarkably stable. A huge part of that stability comes from its role as a key Western ally in the Middle East. Since ascending to the throne in 1999, King Abdullah II, who was educated at Britain's Sandhurst Military Academy and in the US, has cultivated an exceptionally close relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom. Jordan is one of the largest recipients of US foreign aid in the world, receiving billions of dollars in economic and military assistance. This aid is crucial for propping up the Jordanian economy and modernizing its military, which plays a vital role in regional security from the Western perspective. This deep-seated alliance has led to the persistent view that the king, while a respected monarch, is fundamentally constrained by the interests of his Western patrons. Jordan's foreign policy often aligns perfectly with that of the US. It was one of the first Arab nations to sign a peace treaty with Israel. It provides crucial intelligence cooperation in the war on terror, and it often serves as a moderate, mediating voice in regional disputes, a role that is highly valued in Washington and London. Critics, particularly within the more anti-Western camps in the Arab world, see this as a transactional relationship where Jordan trades its political autonomy for economic and military security. They argue that King Abdullah cannot take any major policy decision, be it regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or its relationship with its Arab neighbors, that would seriously jeopardize its relationship with the United States. The country is often described as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the West in a turbulent region, and the king as its captain, who, while in command, must ultimately sail in the direction set by his sponsors. This isn't to say the king is unpopular or seen as illegitimate by his own people. He is generally well regarded. However, the puppet label in this context refers to the structural limitations placed on his rule by geopolitical necessity. His kingdom's very survival has been predicated on this alliance, making him a leader who, by necessity, must balance the needs of his people with the strategic demands of his powerful Western allies. It's a delicate, high-stakes balancing act that he has managed for over 2 decades. For our number 4 spot, we rewind to the tumultuous 1990s and the first president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin. After the dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was in a state of chaos. It needed a new political and economic system, and the West, led by the United States, was more than eager to help shape it. Boris Yeltsin became the face of this transition, and the West's chosen partner in moving Russia towards democracy and capitalism. Throughout the 1990s, Yeltsin's government received substantial support from the West. This came in the form of massive loans from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were essential for keeping the Russian economy afloat. It also came in the form of political advisors, including economists who promoted the controversial shock therapy approach to economic liberalization. The Clinton administration, in particular, invested immense political capital in supporting Yeltsin, seeing him as the only bulwark against a return to communism or the rise of a new, aggressive nationalism. This overt Western backing became a major point of contention within Russia. The economic reforms, which led to hyperinflation, soaring unemployment, and the rise of a small class of super-rich oligarchs, were deeply unpopular. Many Russians came to associate these hardships directly with the Western advice Yeltsin was following. The perception grew that Yeltsin was selling out Russia's national interest to please his sponsors in Washington, dismantling the country's industrial and military might in exchange for loans that seemed to benefit only a corrupt elite. The most blatant example of Western influence came during Yeltsin's 1996 re-election campaign. Trailing badly in the polls against the communist candidate, Yeltsin's victory was secured, in part, by a covert team of American political consultants and a timely $10.2 billion IMF loan, which helped the government pay back wages and pensions just before the election. To many, this looked like a direct intervention by the West to keep their preferred candidate in power, cementing the image of Yeltsin as a leader dependent on and beholden to foreign interests. Yeltsin's legacy is fiercely debated, but the narrative of him as a Western puppet has had lasting consequences. It fueled a deep resentment and suspicion of the West that his successor, Vladimir Putin, would skillfully exploit to consolidate his own power. Putin's entire political project has been, in many ways, a reaction against the Yeltsin years, framed as a restoration of Russian sovereignty after a decade of humiliating subservience to the West. For this reason, Boris Yeltsin remains a powerful symbol of a time when Russia's path was, for better or worse, heavily guided by a Western hand. Number 3 on our list is a controversial and honestly short-lived figure from the Arab Spring Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. Morsi came to power in 2012, representing the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. His election was a seismic event, seemingly heralding a new era of political Islam in the heart of the Arab world. However, from the start, his presidency was dogged by perceptions of external influence, though in a more complex way than others on this list. For decades, the United States had backed the authoritarian regime of Hosni Mubarak, pouring billions in military aid to ensure stability and adherence to the peace treaty with Israel. When the 2011 revolution ousted Mubarak, Washington was forced into a difficult position. After Morsi's victory, the Obama administration chose a policy of cautious engagement, continuing to provide aid and maintaining diplomatic ties. This decision was seen by many Egyptians, particularly in the secular and liberal camps, as a tacit endorsement of the Muslim Brotherhood. The accusation wasn't that Morsi was a classic puppet in the sense of taking direct orders, but that the West, particularly the US, saw him as the least bad option and was willing to work with him to protect its core interests, the security of the Suez Canal and peace with Israel. Critics argued that the West's supposed commitment to democracy was a sham. They were happy to support an Islamist government as long as it played by their rules. Morsi's government, in turn, was seen as trying to appease Washington to ensure the continued flow of vital U.S. aid. This perception created a toxic political environment. Morsi's opponents accused him of being a pawn of the Americans, while his hardline Islamist supporters accused him of being too compromising with the Great Satan. He was caught in an impossible bind. Meetings between Morsi's officials and American diplomats, like then-Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were scrutinized and spun by his opponents as evidence that he was selling out Egypt's revolutionary ideals to a foreign power. When the military, led by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, overthrew Morsi in 2013 after mass protests, the West's reaction was muted. There was no strong condemnation, and U.S. aid to the Egyptian military, though briefly suspended, was soon restored. This was interpreted by many as the West revealing its true preference: a reliable military strongman over a messy and unpredictable Islamist democracy. Morsi's brief, chaotic rule became a case study in the West's pragmatic, interest-driven approach, where even an ideologically opposed leader can be viewed as a temporary, manageable asset. Our runner-up at number 2 is one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, a man who has ruled his country for over 4 decades, Paul Biya of Cameroon. Often called the Sphinx for his, inscrutable and aloof style of governance, Biya has maintained his grip on power since 1982. A key factor in his political longevity has been his close and enduring relationship with Cameroon's former colonial ruler France, and by extension, other Western powers. Biya's rule is a prime example of what is often termed Francafrique, the shadowy network of political, economic, and military ties that has kept many French-speaking African leaders in power long after independence. Cameroon is strategically important, with oil reserves and a key port, and it has been a bastion of stability, or at least the absence of major conflict, in a volatile region. France and other Western nations have long seen Biya as a guarantor of this stability and a protector of their economic interests. This relationship has provided Biya with a crucial lifeline. He has received French military support, including training for his security forces and intelligence cooperation, which has been instrumental in suppressing dissent and fighting insurgencies. French and other Western companies have dominated key sectors of the Cameroonian economy. In return for this support, Biya's government has consistently aligned with French and Western foreign policy positions at the United Nations and other international forums. Critics, both inside Cameroon and across Africa, have long decried Biya as a quintessential puppet of neo-colonial interests. They argue that his long rule has not been based on popular consent, but on the backing of a foreign power that values stability and access to resources over democracy and human rights. Elections in Cameroon have been consistently marred by allegations of fraud, and political opposition is heavily repressed. Yet, for decades, this has elicited little more than mild criticism from Paris and other Western capitals, who seem to view Biya as a necessary evil. Paul Biya represents an older model of the political puppet, not one installed by a recent intervention, but one who is a product of a long-standing post-colonial system of influence. His continued rule, despite his advanced age and widespread discontent, is seen as a testament to the power of his external patrons. He is a living symbol of an era where a leader's most important constituency was not his own people, but the government of a powerful Western nation. And finally, at number 1 on our list of political puppets, we have a leader from a family that has practically defined the concept of neo-colonial rule in Africa, Ali Bongo Ondimba of Gabon. To understand Ali Bongo, you must first understand his father, Omar Bongo, who ruled the oil-rich nation for 42 years until his death in 2009. The Bongo dynasty's power has always been inextricably intertwined with the interests of one country in particular, France. Gabon is a small country with a tiny population but vast oil, timber, and mineral wealth. Since independence, this wealth has been heavily exploited by French companies, most notably the energy giant Elf Aquitaine, now part of Total Energies. The Bongo family allegedly facilitated this access, and in return, the French state provided the political and military security needed to keep them in power. This arrangement was the bedrock of Francafrique, a deeply corrupt system benefiting elites in both France and Gabon. When Omar Bongo died, his son Ali, who had been defense minister, was swiftly maneuvered into power, a succession that had all the hallmarks of a dynastic inheritance blessed by Paris. Ali Bongo's presidency continued this tradition. Despite rhetoric about reform, the fundamental relationship with France and its corporate interests remained unchanged. Elections that returned him to power were widely seen as fraudulent, sparking protests that were violently suppressed by security forces. Yet the French government remained a steadfast ally. The perception among many Gabonese and international observers was that as long as the oil flowed and French interests were secure, the nature of the Bongo regime was of secondary concern to the Elysée palace. The puppet accusation here is deep and generational. It's not just about one leader, but an entire political system built to serve foreign economic interests. The Bongo family was seen as the local management team for Gabon Inc., with the main shareholders residing in Paris. The country's immense wealth did little to benefit the majority of its population, who continue to live in poverty, while the ruling family and their foreign partners allegedly siphoned off billions. The recent 2023 coup that finally ousted Ali Bongo was telling. While the new military junta also has ties to the old system, the coup was met with celebrations on the streets of Libreville. It was seen by many as a potential break from decades of being a private property of the Bongo family and their French patrons. Ali Bongo Ondimba's rule and his fall perfectly encapsulate the corrosive nature of this kind of relationship, where a nation's sovereignty is compromised for generations, making him a fitting, if tragic, figure for the top spot on our list. So there you have it. 10 leaders from around the world who have faced serious accusations of being political puppets for Western powers. From the Americas to Africa, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, the stories are different, but the underlying theme is the same. the complex and often compromising relationship between powerful nations and the leaders of smaller states. This list, as we said at the beginning, is not about passing a final judgment, but about exploring a difficult and often hidden aspect of international relations. It's about questioning who truly benefits when these powerful alliances are formed. The dynamics of global politics are incredibly complex. A leader seeking foreign aid to build schools could be seen as a responsible statesman by some and a puppet by others. Is it a strategic alliance for mutual benefit, or is it a neo-colonial relationship of dependency? The line is often blurry, and the truth depends heavily on your perspective. These are not simple questions with easy answers, and every case we've discussed has layers of nuance that we've only been able to scratch the surface of tonight. The world is rarely a simple stage with good guys and bad guys. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think of our list? Did we miss anyone obvious? Who would you have included in your top 10? This is a conversation that needs to be had, so please head down to the comments section and share your thoughts, your arguments, and your own examples. The more we discuss these power dynamics, the better we can understand the world we live in. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines.